Hi, it's Jessi. Today I am drinking Zest Wishes tea from David's Tea. It was my day 18 advent calendar tea. And there was a review that I will link up there for it. Today we're here for something a little bit unique, another one of my research videos. If you didn't see it a while ago, I did our YA books more, I don't remember what the title of the video was, but I will link it. And I've been meaning to do another one of these research-based videos for a while, so today's topic is going to be, who is the most prolific author? A question I'm sure we all are just dying to have answered. So let me start off by talking about why I want to answer this question. What is the purpose of this research? So in Rid's Discord server a while back when this video goes up, not that long ago for me, we were talking about Seanan McGuire's new releases coming out in 2022, of which there are at least 4 I know of. So she's got a new Wayward Children, the sequel to Middle Game, an Encrypted, and an October Day book coming out at least. And that's not including anything she might be publishing under Mira Grant, or if she's publishing another book as a Deborah Baker. So that's a lot. And it got me thinking about how she might measure up with some of the more famous, prolific authors of our time. So that's what kind of got my brain thinking, got me intrigued, and I decided to dig into it a little bit deeper and see what might turn up. So, methods, starting out, I want to talk about how I picked the authors, what authors I'm going to be researching and why. Of course, we have Seanan McGuire, who is the author that kind of inspired this all. It would be a little silly of me not to include her. Next 3 are the 3 that kind of immediately came to mind for me. So that'd be Brandon Sanderson, who is known for being prolific specifically in the world of fantasy. Nora Roberts and Stephen King, who are like famously prolific authors. Stephen King has written so many horrors. He's writing 1 or 2 every year. And Nora Roberts, who is just the romance queen when it comes to bringing out books. Another author who I almost forgot, but while I was working on this came up because I watched Maximum Ride with my partner, was James Patterson. James Patterson is insane, and maybe I'll include the link if I can find a TikTok a friend of mine shared with me for James Patterson. I mean, the man writes in literally every genre. It's insane. And then Danielle Steel, who I'm mostly including because every time I think of Nora Roberts, it makes me think of Danielle Steel. I don't know if she's actually that prolific, but she came to mind, and I could think of a lot of books, or I've seen her name a lot of places, so I figured I would include her. So, going on from there, methods of how I actually gathered the data here is I use Storygraph. Storygraph is what I use, link in the description if you'd like to follow me. So that's what I did, and I just used whatever the default edition of books came up, basically. I looked up the author on Storygraph, got the long list of their books, and started plugging in on an Excel sheet year pages. I did my best to try to not repeat anything. Sometimes books come up a couple times or come up in different formats. I tried my hardest not to duplicate those. If short stories were published both on their own and in an anthology, I also tried to eliminate that, but of course, sometimes that gets a little weaselly, hard to know for sure. So that may have come up. I'll talk more about possible errors in the data later. What I did then is I removed any duplicates I may have accidentally made. So I ordered everything by page count and then by year. And anything that had the same year and the same page count, I took out, because I figured it is much, much, much more likely that either I or Storygraph made a mistake than the author happened to publish a book in the same year with the same number of pages. It just didn't seem that likely to me. And again, we can go over errors in this study later. Other things I did, I didn't include anthologies that were written by more than one author. What I did was if 5 or more authors were listed on a title, I didn't count it, but I did count co-written books, which would be if 4 or fewer authors were listed, including obviously the one I was interested in. And then at the end, I determined the total number of pages published at the end of a year. So year 1 would be total all the books added, and then year 2 would be all the books published from the first year plus any books they published their second year publishing, if that makes sense. Hopefully when you see the graphs, you'll see what I mean. So let's get into our results here. I don't have a lot to say before we get started, other than these are not in an order specific to try to lead you to who the most prolific author is. I'm actually putting them in the order from who started publishing the soonest, which, as it turns out, is Stephen King. So Stephen King, in the 52 years that he has been publishing, he has published 250 books and short stories with a total of 70,963 pages. I do want to say for King that I didn't count anything that was published before 1970. He had a few things published, but they were all things that were very low page count and assorted, so I figured it would be kind of unfair to include those, and then maybe it's unfair not to include them to the other authors, but that's what I chose to do. The other thing with Stephen King is that he has some graphic novel editions of his books, and this will come up again with James Patterson, and yeah, just those two, that they have graphic novel editions of their books. I counted those both twice whenever they came up because adapting does change things. So anyway, 52 books, 52 years, 250 books, 70,000, almost 71,000 pages. And that comes out then when you average pages per year, you get 1,365 pages per year, or 4.8, almost 5 books published per year by Stephen King. So that's where we're starting. Here's the graph for his. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I'll let you look at this as you want. But you can see the graph I did. I did a linear equation for all of them, and I set the y-intercept to the origin, because if you haven't published anything yet, you have no pages published yet. And this works out pretty well for almost all of the authors. If you look at the R-squared value, like for almost everybody, this is pretty good. For example, Stephen King here has an R-squared value of 99 hundredths. That's insane. And so basing that on this, given the slope that we have, this would come out to about 1,285 books published per year, given that slope. Going on to our next author, that's Danielle Steel. In the 49 years she's been publishing, she has written 121 books, or published 121 books, I should be specific there. And those 121 books make up 42,738 pages. Not gonna make any judgment calls here, and I should have said this at the top, I'll say it again later, but this is not talking about quality of books at all, but Danielle Steel is the only author of the 6 that I'm looking at that doesn't have a single co-authored book, at least that I can remember. And maybe I'm forgetting 1 or 2, but like remarkably few co-authored books. So the 121 books, the 43-ish thousand pages that she wrote. And this comes out then to about 872 pages per year, or 2.5 books per year. So she's quite a bit lower than all of the other authors on this list, just kind of a little spoiler alert. But it was kind of fun to look at that and have something a little closer to normal to compare to. And here's her graph. So she also had an insane R-squared, almost 99 hundredths again. And her slope based here is going to be 787 books per year based on the slope of her equation. If you ever want to look at any of these graphs, feel free to pause. I also might include a link to the slideshow below so that you can just flip through at your own leisure if you want. All right, and next up, James Patterson. James Patterson, oh, Jimmy. Jimmy's going to be a unique one, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. But using the same standards that I have given all of the authors so far, James Patterson, in the 46 years he has been writing, has published 342 books, or 108,221 pages, which is a lot. That comes out to about 2,353 pages per year, or 7.5-ish books per year. Jimmy Patterson is a busy boy. Like, insane. Here's the graph though. And if you look at this graph, you'll notice something very interesting here. First off, the linear equation does not work for his graph nearly as well as it works for everybody else. He had the lowest R-squared value. That said, 89 hundredths is still an insanely high R-squared value. That's pretty high, moderate high correlation there. And here, he probably has, I think of everyone, the most dramatic difference between my calculated pages per year and what the slope was, because the slope here is giving him 1,567 pages per year. But here's what I want to do. I want to zoom in a little bit on that one part of the graph, because if we take out the first 20, 25 years of his publishing, things get dramatically different. So James Patterson, throughout the 20th century, he started publishing in like the late 70s and was publishing through the 80s and the 90s. In that time, he was publishing one book every few years. And almost all of the books he published were solo works. I think there were like 2 or 3 that were co-written, but almost all of them were solo works, and they were all in the mystery thriller, some of them slightly fantasy, but mystery thriller genre. But then something strange happened in the early 2000s. So this graph, I'm kind of zooming in on like 2001, that like after he'd been publishing for 20 years, 25 years. I'm gonna give you statistics for 2001 on, which is after he'd been publishing for 25 years. You start to see some things change. He starts publishing in a ton of different genres, and almost all of his books start being co-written after that part. He's no longer just writing adult thrillers. He's suddenly writing young adult and middle grade, that came later, and romance and erotica and more fantasy, and he's just really exploding into a lot of other genres, and they're almost all co-written. I'm not gonna put my conspiracy hat on. You can draw your own conclusions from this. But if we skip to 2001, so James Patterson, Jimmy, has been publishing for 25 years on his own and then starts doing these co-written stuff. If we just take from 2001 on, that would be 21 years of publishing. And in that time, he has published 318 books or 99,328 pages. This doubles what the rate of things were before. It's now he's publishing 15 books per year and about 4,730 pages per year. It more than doubles what he was doing before. So something hit that 2001 and that curve skyrocketed, which is gonna be definitely interesting to look at going forward for Jimmy. So moving on here to Nora Roberts, I want to say up front, of all of the authors, Nora Roberts is the one I am most likely to have underestimated on. There's a couple reasons for this. First is because she does publish under pseudonyms some of the time, but I don't know her pseudonym, so I couldn't do research into that like I could with Seanan McGuire. So that's that. Also, and this happened a little bit with Stephen King, but I'm more familiar with Stephen King's work, and it happened a little bit with Danielle Steel, but not as much. That sometimes she publishes books in anthologies of like 2 to 3 books, but it's not always clear when those were published, because they're not necessarily part of a series. So you don't always have that like series moniker. It doesn't always say omnibus or anthology. So I was kind of erring on the side of caution with that. So it's very possible that I just left out books she had written. Yeah, and there's also, so if anything, I did Nora Roberts dirty, and I want you to keep that in mind as I go through hers. So Nora Roberts, in the 41 years she has been writing, has written 289 books or 101,776 pages. This then comes out to 2,482 pages per year or 7 books per year. So on the high end of what Jimmy Pats is doing the whole time. And here's her graph here. Nora Roberts, I do want to highlight, is the only author here who her curve is under the projected linear equation. All the other authors seem to be curving up, so speeding up how much they publish. Nora Roberts seems to be the one that's slowing down a little. which is why she's also the only author I have that the slope of the line is higher than my projected books per year, pages per year. So for Nora Roberts, the slope of the line predicts that she publishes 2,781 pages per year. And again, just highlighting that R-squared value, insanely high. All right, we're getting through it. We're getting to our new more modern authors now. Starting with Brandon Sanderson. So Brandon Sanderson has been publishing for 21 years, which is longer than I thought. And in that time, he has written 61 books and short stories and has published 22,559 pages. I do want to highlight, I didn't highlight this in my methods because it only matters for Brandon Sanderson, that I did not include game manuals in this because Brandon Sanderson has a couple board games based on his books, and he's written the game manuals for that, and I did not include those because, quite frankly, that doesn't make any sense to me. So instead we have just the books and stories, novels, novellas that he's written. So this then comes out to 1,074 pages per year, 3 books per year, which is nothing to sneeze at, but after James Patterson and Nora Roberts, looks like nothing. But it really isn't anything to sneeze at. That's still pretty insane. So going on to his graph here, you can see it, and yeah, there was a big gap. He published one thing in 2001 and then didn't publish anything for 5 years. But his graph shows him at 935 pages per year. But his R-square is also a little bit lower, and I think that's probably because of that gap. And last but certainly not least, the thing that started it all, Seanan McGuire. For Seanan McGuire, I did include her title. For Seanan McGuire, I did include her titles that are published under Mira Grant, but I did forget A. Deborah Baker. I don't think that's gonna make a big difference. There's only 2 books out by A. Deborah Baker right now, and they're both short novellas, so I don't think it would make a huge impact on the results, but I do want to be clear about that up front here. So Seanan McGuire has published 27,068 pages, or 164 books in 13 years. So 13 years, 164 books. This comes out to 2,082 pages per year, or 12.6 books per year, 12 and a half books per year. She writes a lot of novellas, which is why it's an insane number of books, but a little bit lower on the page count, at least compared to some of these authors. And here is Seanan McGuire's graph. This shows that she has published on 1,857 pages per year. I didn't mention this on the other graphs, but I do want to be clear on these scatter plots for the individual authors. This is including all of the pages. So if they published 5 different books in 1 year, there's going to be 5 dots on that year, getting progressively higher, which also might have had an impact, but overall I feel like, if anything, made it more equal over time. But I do want to highlight that quickly because I haven't talked about it yet. Before we get into the results, I do want to talk through some of the possible errors that could have happened here. Now, some of these are ones I've kind of already talked about, so I'm going to try to go through this kind of quickly. There's a lot of things, human error, that could have just messed up, not including co-authored novels. Some of them might have been more anthologies. May have messed up on accidentally including omnibuses and including the short stories, but I really tried not to. I did use whatever the default edition of Storygraph is to kind of save time on this, because if I had to click and make sure I was on the original hardcover yada yada edition, that would be insane. So there may have been an inconsistency in addition. There's also the fact that different publishers, different genres, different whatever, have different fonts and margins and all of that. So also page count is not necessarily the most accurate representation of how much authors have written, but I was not about to put in the time to try to figure out exact word counts for all of these authors. I already talked about some books may have come in twice. I will talk about with deleting the double listings. It might have been a mistake, but again, I talked about that. Every once in a while, there would be a book by another author on here. That's not really something that's made mistakes because I recognized it, like James Patterson has written a lot, but he did not write Girl Paper Fire. So that was pretty much also not a mistake, but King and Patterson both have like a lot of nonfiction that I was unexpected. Repeated graphic novel editions. Okay, actually I've already talked about most of this, so just human error, it happens. I think on average it is more likely than not that this balanced out. The errors that I made to inflate the page count probably was balanced out by any errors I made to decrease the page count, and also I did this pretty equally across the board, and as I've already addressed, if anybody was harmed by this, it was probably Nora Roberts. So, are you guys ready? Let's go to the combined graph. So this first one I'm actually showing you is with the date, the actual year on here. I just think this is kind of a prettier way to show the data because you can see it a little spread out. And I do think it's a little interesting. Pause, look at whatever you want here. You can see some things that I think are interesting. You can see the order they've been publishing in. You know, you have King, then Danielle Steel, then Patterson, and then Nora Roberts. You can see kind of that initial slope of things and how different they are, dramatically different they are. And I also think it's interesting to see how many they have published at the end of their career here. Like the fact that James Patterson, is now above Roberts, but for most of their career, Roberts was way above him. Or the fact that Roberts is way above King and Steel, who have been publishing way longer than she has. Or the fact that McGuire has already overcome Sanderson, even though they're writing in similar genres, and he is more well known for his prolific writing. So I think it's interesting I could have been using the laser pointer the whole time. I do think it's interesting to sit and compare where they are currently, even though they're all at different points in their careers. That said, here's the final results, adjusted for years of publishing. So, you know, everybody starting out at 0, and going from there. And this highlights, I think, what I would define as the most prolific author. If you're going with prolific being number of pages published per year, you can see very clearly at the point of their career at which they are. Nora Roberts and Seanan McGuire are really in the lead there. If we look at where Seanan McGuire currently is, the only person above her at that point in time in their career was Nora Roberts. And we talked about Nora Roberts is starting to slow down. She was still at the point in her career she's still above James Patterson, but it definitely looks like if she continues her trajectory, she'll probably dip below him by the time she gets to where he's at. But it's also interesting to think about if, you know, Seanan McGuire continues her current trajectory, she'll probably cross over with him. But if she had an insane arc like he did, and after 25 years she skyrockets more than she already has, really, I think it also puts a lot of things into perspective just in the fact that, you know, I mean, you have that weird skyrocket where James Patterson wouldn't even be a competitor in this the first 25 years of his career, and it's only more recently that he has skyrocketed. I also think that's an interesting thing to put in perspective here. Yeah, I think it's crazy, and I think Seanan McGuire is not getting the credit that she deserves. That's kind of my conclusion here. Yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's where it comes down to, is that Seanan McGuire has done some crazy things, and she is not getting credit she deserves for that. That when you think prolific fantasy author, your mind goes to Brandon Sanderson, and it turns out it's not that prolific. So, we'll see. But this was really interesting. I thought it was really fun. Leave your comments below. I need two things. One, if there are any prolific authors you think I left off of this, anybody you think can compete. I didn't really give my final conclusion here, but the conclusion here was that if we're defining prolific as over the course of their career, pages published per year they have been publishing, the most prolific author would be Nora Roberts. If we are talking prolific as in recent years, James Patterson. However, Seanan McGuire is pretty close there. Stephen King and Brandon Sanderson, pretty respectable. If you think there is an author that can compete with those that are publishing around that same 2,000, 2,500 pages per year number, let me know, and I would be interested in diving into that, looking into that, maybe making a part 2. The other thing, who do you think is like the average, or even if you can find an article about like what the average author publishes per year, to put this into perspective a little bit more, because only looking at the insanely high numbers, not really doing anybody any good. All right, that is gonna be it from me. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I had fun making it and just kind of doing this kind of research. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.